I never believed the stories growing up. The whispers around campfires, the stern warnings from my grandmother, the tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. It all seemed like folklore designed to keep us in line. But last fall, something happened that I can't explain. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow, unblinking eyes staring back at me. It started when I agreed to help my cousin, Jake, fix up his cabin in the Utah wilderness. The place had been in our family for decades, but no one really used it anymore. Jake had recently bought it off our uncle and wanted to turn it into a hunting retreat. I thought a weekend away from the grind would be relaxing. The forest out there is old, thick with pine and oak, the kind of place that swallows sound and sunlight alike. By the time I reached, the light was already fading, casting the whole clearing in a golden haze. Jake greeted me with his usual grin and a beer. We spent the first day clearing out debris, patching holes, and swapping stories about our childhood summers spent out here. By nightfall, we were exhausted but in good spirits. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like the creak of a floorboard or the groan of an old tree bending in the wind. I brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep, but then it came again, closer this time. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. It wasn't an animal sound, not exactly. It had a cadence to it, like someone mimicking an animal but not quite getting it right. I crept to the window and peered out into the dark. The moon was bright, its silver light spilling over the clearing. First, I saw nothing. But then, just at the edge of the tree line, something moved. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs were wrong, too long and crooked at odd angles. It stood there, motionless, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Jake, wake up. He stirred groggily but sat up when he saw my face. What's wrong? There's someone. Jake grabbed the flashlight and his old hunting rifle and motioned for me to stay behind. I wasn't about to let him go out there alone, so I followed, clutching a rusted crowbar I'd found in earlier. We scanned the tree line, the flashlight's beam cutting through the dark. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Jake muttered something about deer and paranoia, but I wasn't convinced. As we turned, the sound came again. A long, drawn-out groan that sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from the other side of the clearing now. Jake swore under his breath and raised the rifle. "Who's there?" he shouted. For a moment there was silence. Then, a voice called back. A voice that sounded exactly like Jake's. "Jake? Help." My blood ran cold. Jake froze beside me, his grip tightening on the rifle. "That's not funny," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. But the voice came again, this time closer. "Jake, it's me." I grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward. "We need to go inside. Now." Jake hesitated, but the fear in my voice must have convinced him. For a long time we sat in the dark, listening. The groans and creaks came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far. At one point, something scratched at the door, slow and deliberate. "Jake." It was my voice this time, distorted but unmistakable. "Let me in." I thought I might lose my mind right then and there. Jake's face was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched the rifle. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning the woods were eerily quiet. Jake insisted we leave, but when we stepped outside, we found our truck tires slashed. Deep gouges ran across the rubber, like they'd been clawed apart. We had no choice but to hike out. The forest felt wrong that day, every shadow too deep, every rustle of leaves too loud. Several times, I thought I saw movement in the distance, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Jake kept the rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the path ahead like a hawk. Neither of us spoke. It felt like the forest itself was listening. The further we walked, the more disoriented I felt, like the trees were subtly shifting around us. The path we had taken just yesterday, clear and straightforward, now seemed unfamiliar, the turns sharper, the underbrush thicker. "Do you remember this fork in the trail?" I whispered, keeping my voice low as if not to disturb the uneasy silence. Jake stopped and looked around, his brow furrowing. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't." The two paths stretched out before us like veins in the earth, one leading slightly uphill and the other descending into a darker thicket of trees. Neither looked like the route we had taken to the cabin, but the idea of heading downhill, deeper into shadow, made my stomach churn. "Let's go up," I suggested, my voice trembling. Jake nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. As we climbed, the oppressive stillness grew heavier. Even the birds had stopped calling. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered tree stump, its surface carved with strange, jagged symbols. They weren't letters or anything I recognized, just deep, chaotic grooves that looked almost deliberate. Jake stared at it, his knuckles white around the rifle stock. "This wasn't here before," he muttered. "None of this was here before," I said, glancing nervously around the clearing. The trees seemed to loom closer now, their gnarled branches twisting together like claws. A faint smell drifted on the air, earthy and metallic, like damp soil and rust. I tried to ignore it, but it made my stomach turn. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked suddenly, his voice tight. I strained my ears, but at first, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, faintly, I caught it, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like the tapping of stones against one another. It came from somewhere just beyond the tree line, circling us slowly. Jake raised the rifle, his eyes darting from tree to tree. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The clicking grew louder, closer, until it was all around us. I spun in place, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to echo from every direction. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Jake and I stood frozen, our breath hanging in the cool air. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my throat felt like it was full of sand. Then, from the far side of the clearing, something stepped out from the shadows. At first glance, it looked like a deer, but the longer I stared, the more I realized how wrong it was. Its legs were too long, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn. The fur was patchy and mottled, hanging in clumps like it didn't belong. Its head was too large, the antlers jagged and uneven, and its eyes were empty, black pits that seemed to suck in the dim light around them. It didn't move like an animal, either. It stepped forward, one slow, deliberate motion at a time, its body jerking slightly with each movement, as if it were unused to walking. And then it stopped, tilting its head toward us. Jake raised the rifle, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted. The thing didn't flinch. Instead, it opened its mouth, too wide, the jaw unhinging like a snake's, and let out a sound that froze my blood. It wasn't a growl or a scream, but something in between, a noise that vibrated through my chest and made my ears ring. I staggered back, clutching my head. Jake fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, deafeningly loud, but the thing didn't even flinch. It just stood there, staring, its head tilting ever so slightly as if it were curious. "Run," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "What?" I stammered, my legs rooted to the spot. "Run," he shouted, grabbing my arm and shoving me toward the uphill path. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the earth. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it behind us. The clicking sound, faster now, almost frantic. The forest blurred around me as we ran, the trees blending into a wall of dark shapes. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the sound kept coming, closer and closer. Finally, we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto a dirt road that a battered pickup truck was parked a few yards away, and an older man in a flannel shirt was standing by the driver's side, staring at us with wide eyes. "Get in," he shouted, waving us over. We didn't hesitate. Jake dove into the truck bed, and I scrambled into the passenger seat as the man gunned the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and we sped off down the road, leaving the forest and whatever was in it behind. I glanced back once, just as we rounded a bend. For a split second, I saw it standing at the edge of the trees, its hollow eyes following us. Then it turned and melted into the shadows. That should have been the end of it. We escaped, didn't we? Jake and I made it out of the forest alive. But even as the miles stretched between us and that clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come with us, that we hadn't truly left it behind. When we got back to Jake's place, he poured 2 stiff drinks without a word and downed his in one gulp. His hands shook as he reached for the second. The room felt too quiet, too small, as if the air had been sucked out. I couldn't stop replaying the image of that thing, its jagged antlers, its too wide jaw, the way it didn't flinch when Jake fired. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally asked, his voice raw. "That thing. That wasn't—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "That wasn't normal." I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. Normal wasn't the word for what we'd seen. Jake didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the clicking again, that relentless, rhythmic sound that had followed us through the woods. It crept into my dreams, into the quiet moments when I let my guard down, always just out of sight. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was over. Whatever we'd encountered was tied to that forest, I told myself, and we were safe as long as we stayed far away. But the unease never left. It clung to me like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. 3 nights later, I woke up to a strange sound outside my apartment window. At first, I thought it was the wind. It was faint, a soft rustling that could have been leaves or the creak of a distant branch. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate, a scratching sound, like nails dragging slowly across glass. My heart hammered as I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay still. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But something compelled me, some horrible curiosity I couldn't suppress. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but there was a silhouette behind them, dark and impossibly tall. The shape was wrong, too thin, with jagged edges that pressed against the fabric like claws. My breath caught in my throat as the figure shifted, its head tilting in that unnatural, curious way I'd seen in the clearing. "Jake!" The scratching stopped. The room fell deathly silent, so quiet I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. And then, from outside the window, I heard it, my own voice. "Let me in." I froze. The words were mine, but the cadence was all wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, like it was mimicking me and didn't quite know how. "Let me in," it said again, a little louder this time. The voice cracked on the last word, as if it were breaking apart. I don't remember grabbing my phone, but suddenly it was in my hands, and I was calling Jake. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before he picked up. "It's outside," he said. It's right outside." We didn't need to say what it was. We both knew. It had found us. "Don't open the door," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Don't even look at it." I started, but then I stopped. "Jake!" It's at my window." There was a pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Can't come in unless you let it." The scratching started again, harder this time, more frantic. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold on to it. The thing outside must have heard it hit the floor because it stopped scratching. The silence that followed was worse, expectant, like it was waiting for me to slip up. The door opened. My blood turned to ice as I heard the faint click of the latch, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of hinges. I didn't dare move. My apartment was small, one bedroom, an open living area, and the door was just a few feet away from where I sat on the couch. I heard footsteps now, soft and uneven, like it was dragging one leg. The air grew colder with each step, and a low, guttural sound rose from its throat. The same sound I'd heard in the woods. I shut my eyes, squeezing them tight, and prayed it would go away. But then I felt it, a presence towering over me, its breath cold and rancid on my neck. "Let me in," it said again, the words rasping like leaves in the wind. I don't remember what happened next. One moment, I was sitting there, paralyzed with fear, and the next, I was stumbling out of my apartment, barefoot and shaking, into the cold night air. The street was empty, the world eerily quiet. I ran to Jake's house. When he opened the door, he looked just as wrecked as I felt. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. It had followed us home. Jake let me in without a word. His house felt as heavy and suffocating as my own had before. We spent the rest of the night barricading the windows and doors, piling furniture against the entrances like it would make a difference. Felt futile. When the sun rose, we sat in the living room, the barricades casting strange shadows across the walls. I hadn't slept in days, and I could tell Jake hadn't either. He was pale, his hands trembling as he nursed a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake stared at the floor, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said. I thought getting out of the forest would be enough." "It's not," I said, the words heavier than I expected. "It's not going to stop, is it?" Jake didn't answer. By midday, I decided to go back to my apartment. I don't know what possessed me to return. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could reclaim my space, that I wasn't a prisoner to whatever this thing was. Jake begged me not to go, but I promised to call him every hour and left before he could argue further. The apartment felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, and the blinds I'd left drawn were now open, the weak sunlight casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. My throat tightened as I saw the window, the one where I'd seen the silhouette. A faint smear, like a handprint, marred the glass. I tried to ignore it as I gathered a bag of essentials, shoving clothes and supplies into it with shaking hands. But then I heard it again, the clicking, soft at first like it was testing the air, then louder, more insistent. It wasn't outside this time. It was coming from the hallway. I froze, my mind racing. Slowly, I turned toward the door, my body stiff with dread. The shadows under the door shifted, and then came the sound of the knob turning. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't wait to see what came next. I didn't stop until I was back at Jake's house. He let me in, his face pale and drawn. "It was inside," I choked out. It was inside." Jake's expression darkened, and he nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. "It's not just following us. It's trying to take us." I stared at him, my heart hammering. "Take us?" He swallowed hard. "I don't think it's a matter of whether we can run or hide anymore. I think it's a matter of when." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, But deep down, I knew he was right. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to give up. And the worst part? Could wait. We spent the next few days together, locked inside, trying to figure out a plan. Jake wanted to go back to the forest, to confront it, but I refused. Something about that idea felt like a trap, like it was exactly what the thing wanted. But staying wasn't an option either. Every night, the sounds came, the clicking, the scratching, the mimicry of our voices. And every morning, we found signs that it had been closer than before. A handprint on the window, a scuff on the door, a faint indentation in the carpet where no one had stepped. Jake stopped talking, his eyes hollow and dark. I started jumping at every sound, convinced it was inside even when I couldn't see it. We were prisoners in our own lives, our own minds. Then, one night, I woke to silence. The kind of silence that felt purposeful. My throat tightened as I sat up, my ears straining. Jake was gone. His bed, which had been set up in the living room for safety, was empty, the sheets rumpled. I called out for him, but there was no answer. The front door was open, the barricades shoved aside. Panic overtook me as I stepped outside into the cold night air. The street was empty, the world cloaked in shadows. But then I saw him standing at the edge of the woods, just like before. His back was to me, his posture stiff and unnatural. "Jake!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't move. "Jake, please." I took a hesitant step forward, my chest tight. "Come back." Slowly, he turned. His face was wrong. Too long, too pale, with those hollow, endless eyes. And then he smiled, a wide, jagged grin that split his face unnaturally. "Let me in," he said. His voice distorted and cracked. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. Behind him, the shadows of the trees shifted, and more figures began to emerge, tall, thin. That was the end for me.